As we saw in the previous episode, the social, administrative and military fractures between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England are deep and only growing. The only remaining link between the island kingdom and the continent is the Plantagenet family on the English throne, a bond that the 100 Years' War would eventually sever completely from its French roots. War is thus inevitable. While everyone knows the major land battles of the 100 Years' War, few realize that the first large-scale confrontation of the conflict took place at sea. Let's take a closer look at what led to the greatest naval battle of the Middle Ages, the Battle of SLUYS. Vae Victis, a casus belli production. As we mentioned in earlier episodes, in retaliation for the unacceptable actions of Edward III, who incited the Flemish cloth towns to revolt, Philip VI decided to confiscate Guyenne. In October 1337, the English king declared war on the King of France. At the end of the Middle Ages, England, despite being an island, had no real navy at its disposal, and it was therefore difficult for Edward III to come to the aid of the Seneschal of Aquitaine, Oliver Ingham, who was facing a French army of 12,000 men, besieging the various strongholds of the region. Aware that crossing from England to Aquitaine was perilous for an army, the English king allowed the inhabitants of the duchy to take refuge in their castles, and looked instead to open a second front, to relieve what remained of his continental possessions. And what better place than rebellious Flanders to launch an army onto the continent? Before venturing into such a risky expedition, Edward III sought to form an anti-French coalition. By distributing large sums of gold, he gathered the Count of Hainaut, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Duke of Brabant, and the Count of Namur. To rally these powerful barons to his cause, Edward III made wildly unrealistic promises of payment. The total subsidies he promised amounted to £160,000, 10 times the average annual income of the Kingdom of England. Organizing a massive landing was no simple matter in the Middle Ages, and problems quickly piled up. The army, which was supposed to be ready by the end of September, was only assembled by late November, far too late to launch a campaign in Flanders, especially since bad news was coming from Scotland. Supporters of David Bruce, aided by French reinforcements, had taken control of most of the country and were now besieging Edinburgh. A portion of the English army had to be redirected north, and the campaign in Flanders had to be postponed. Given all these delays, the coalition was already starting to unravel. Several barons were demanding partial payment of the promised subsidies and reimbursement of their advance expenses. The English crown had to borrow even more money to keep its allies in line. Fortunately for Edward, things weren't going smoothly on the other side of the channel either. In Aquitaine, despite extremely limited means, Seneschal Ingham managed to keep the French troops, commanded by Constable Raoul de Brienne, at bay. The latter wasted time besieging every isolated castle in Aquitaine, and achieved no significant victories by the time winter arrived. In November, the king entrusted operations to the Count of Foix and John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia. They managed to take fortified bastions one by one, and even laid siege to Bordeaux, the capital of English Aquitaine. The city was on the verge of falling, but the siege was lifted due to insufficient supplies for the 12,000 French troops. Indeed, in the 100 Years' War, the besiegers were often the first to run out of food. Defense was more effective than offense. Philip VI, unaware of Edward III's difficulties and plans, felt betrayed from all sides and grew increasingly paranoid. By the end of 1337, he had begun to lose the trust of his closest advisors. The following winter was significant for several reasons. While Gaston de Foix continued to ravage Aquitaine for the French king and Philip VI, ships plundered the south of England, the Flemish launched a true revolution, led by a wealthy burgher named Jacob van Artevelde. Both workers and merchants called for closer ties with England, so that wool shipments could resume. They directly opposed their count, Louis of Nevers, who remained loyal to the French king. The few partisans of Louis of Nevers were crushed, and the count fled to Paris, while Jacob van Artevelde, having taken control of the county, increasingly and openly sided with England. Yet Edward III's situation remained precarious. As he was theoretically a vassal of the French king, his open rebellion amounted to treason, something that could worry his allies. To secure their support, Edward crossed the Rubicon and challenged Philip VI's title as King of France. Although he had previously acknowledged his inferiority through acts of fealty, and even though the English Parliament had recognized years earlier that Edward III had no claim to the French crown, he now denied all of that. Even assuming the crown of France could be transmitted through the female line, Edward wouldn't have been first in line. That place would go to young Charles of Navarre, son of Joan of Navarre and grandson of Louis X. Still, Edward's decision had the merit of clarifying the diplomatic situation between the two kingdoms. He now explicitly viewed Philip VI as a usurper. The war was no longer just feudal, it had become dynastic, and would now continue until one of the two claimants was eliminated or renounced his claim. The Flemish rebels under Van Artevelde recognized Edward as King of France despite protests from the Count of Flanders, while the Pope, unable to accept such a disruption to the established order, placed the county under interdict. This meant that religious sacraments could no longer be performed there. Edward then took the title, King of France and England, changed his coat of arms to a quartered shield of fleurs-de-lis and 3 leopards, and already saw himself on the path to coronation. He summoned all the barons of the Kingdom of France to Ghent on February 6, 1340. It was a resounding failure. No one came, except the Flemish who were already there. Absolute humiliation. Discontent grew in England against a king dragging them into a seemingly endless war. Ruined, Edward III returned to his island on February 21st to beg Parliament for new subsidies. They were granted, reluctantly. A few weeks later, upon learning that Edward III was preparing a fleet, Philip VI dispatched his own ships into the North Sea. More than 200 vessels set out from the ports of Normandy, Brittany and Picardy toward the Channel. The French king had a hard time assembling his fleet. Of the Genoese who were supposed to deliver ships and provide assistance, only the privateer Pietro Barbavera remained, with just 2 galleys. Moreover, the ports of northern France had been devastated by the English during the winter, with 18 galleys and 24 merchant ships sunk. Philip VI thus requisitioned anything he could find, merchant ships, fishing vessels, to fill out the ranks of his sea army. Sea army, for it was not yet called a navy. Ships were primarily seen as a means of transporting an army that would fight on land. Most of the ships in the armadas of the time were merely civilian vessels, that a few deck-mounted crossbows and a few dozen men-at-arms sufficed to convert into warships. Indeed, it was a full-fledged army that embarked, 20,000 men distributed across 200 French ships. Apart from the handful of Genoese professionals, veterans of naval warfare against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean, there were only 500 crossbowmen and 150 professional men-at-arms. The rest were conscripts with no experience. Beyond this glaring lack of seasoned fighters, the main weakness of the French armada lay in its admirals. The French fleet's admiral, Hugues Quéré, though undeniably talented as an organizer, had no naval training. By appointing him head of the fleet, the king clearly had no expectation of a naval battle, seeing the fleet merely as a means of transporting his army of knights and men-at-arms. The second in command was Nicolas Béhuchet, the king's treasurer and master of accounts. Though he had organized several commando operations on the English coast, he too had no experience in naval combat. Edward III fully aware that losing control of the sea would mean losing the war, gathered every vessel at his disposal. Nearly 250 ships of all kinds were assembled, carrying 16,000 troops, 12,000 archers, and 4,000 seasoned men-at-arms, plus the sailors for the Channel crossing in June 1340. Although the English had numerical superiority, that alone would not be decisive. The true difference came from the experience of English soldiers and the disastrous French tactics that would send Philip VI's Sea Army into the depths of the North Sea. The French admiral had orders to prevent the English troops from landing, and he chose to simply block their route to Bruges. Despite the advice of the Genoese privateer Barbavera, who wanted to intercept the English fleet on the open sea, the French commanders decided to anchor their ships in 3 lines, sails down, prows and sterns aligned, in the estuary of the Scheldt between the island of Cadzand and the village of Termuden, on the mainland, directly across from the port of SLUYS. This was a fundamental error. From a fleet that might have been maneuverable at sea, the French command had created a simple barricade, right in front of which the English fleet appeared on June 24, 1340. The English fleet stopped in front of the French barricade. For a moment, it seemed they were hesitating, perhaps turning back. In reality, they were waiting for the tide to turn in their favor before launching the assault. The greatest naval battle of the medieval era was about to begin. Only 4 French ships, the largest, were free at the front of the formation. The others were still arranged in 3 rows and unable to maneuver. But maneuvering wasn't even on the French admiral's mind. In a final display of incompetence, the ships had been chained together to reinforce the barricade and were moored on both sides of the strait where they were anchored. They were thus not only immobile, but also within range of Flemish projectiles from the shore. Battle broke out between the 4 forward French ships and 4 English vessels. The French crossbowmen boarded first and initially had the upper hand, but quickly realized that their crossbows were ineffective in the close quarters of naval combat where enemies could easily take cover. They had no choice but to fight with knives and axes. Meanwhile, the English archers, who made up the bulk of the army, rained down arrows. In less than an hour, the situation became desperate for the French vanguard. A last-ditch counterattack was launched by Quieres and Béhuchet themselves. Once again, the French had the early advantage. One of the 4 English ships was sunk, and Edward III's flagship, the Thomas, was boarded. The king was seriously wounded in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. However, the tide again turned in favor of the English. Béhuchet and Quieres were captured. The former was hanged on the spot, and Quieres was beheaded on deck. The tone was set. No quarter would be given. From then on, it was a massacre. Only the chained, immobile French ships remained. The English tactic was simple. Groups of 3 ships advanced. 2 were packed with archers who riddled the French line with arrows, while the French crossbowmen, having shorter range, could not retaliate. Then came the 3rd ship, carrying men-at-arms, who boarded the French vessels to finish the job. Violent hand-to-hand combat ensued on the decks. It was effectively a land battle fought at sea. As the first French line was overrun, the second and third lines stood helpless, unable to intervene, merely awaiting their turn. While the first line collapsed, the Flemish struck from the rear, sealing the fate of the battle. Panic ensued. Men jumped overboard in a desperate attempt to escape the slaughter. Drowning was added to the death toll. A few managed to reach shore, only to find themselves in hostile territory. Those captured by the Flemish were tortured and executed. The battle lasted all afternoon until sunset. By the end of the day, 18,000 French were dead, mostly drowned, compared to about 1,000 English. The Battle of SLUYS was the first real battle of the conflict, and would remain the bloodiest of the entire 100 Years' War. Even before the first land battle, English archers and their longbows had demonstrated their supremacy on the field of war. Out of the 200 French ships present at the beginning of the battle, only about 20 managed to escape. The English victory was total and undeniable. France would take nearly 30 years to rebuild a maritime presence worthy of the name in the Western Seas. Meanwhile, the English controlled the sea and could move freely between the island and Flanders, as well as Aquitaine, and soon Brittany, which would quickly become another zone of conflict. This medieval Trafalgar, however, was a hollow victory for the English. While a defeat would have crushed their continental ambitions, this total success merely gave Edward III the chance to continue pressing his claim to the French crown. Nothing was guaranteed. Moreover, the French chivalry, the backbone of the medieval French army, remained untouched. Philip VI, therefore, didn't seem particularly alarmed by the maritime defeat. After disembarking his troops, the King of England laid siege to Tournai, a city surrounded by 5 kilometers of ramparts and flanked by 74 towers, defended by a garrison of 5,800 soldiers under the command of the Constable of France, Godemar du Fay. Edward III lost more than 2 months, while Philip VI's army camped in the area around Bouvines. The memory of Philip Augustus still loomed over Bouvines, but this time there would be no miraculous battle. Edward III sought a pitched confrontation with the French army, but Philip VI had no intention of giving him one. Instead, he preferred to keep alive the very real threat of an English invasion to more easily justify raising taxes. However, the personal prestige and image of the French king were seriously damaged. This was the second time since the war had begun that he had refused battle despite having superior numbers, and he was increasingly seen as a coward by the public, who were beginning to question the purpose of the taxes they paid to fund an army that refused to fight. Meanwhile, internal divisions emerged within the kingdom. The eastern, central, and southeastern regions of France felt little concern for a war that mainly affected Picardy and Normandy, whose lands were ravaged. Far from strengthening national unity, the beginning of the 100 Years' War actually deepened the fractures within the kingdom. As for Edward III, he was furious. His campaign, which had started so well with the victory at SLUYS, was now bogged down. His financial situation was at rock bottom, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to convince his parliament to fund a continental campaign that brought no tangible gains, especially while the guerrilla warfare led by David Bruce's partisans wreaked havoc in Scotland, and most of Aquitaine remained under French control. The English king was bankrupt and now found himself on the defensive. The anti-French alliance had also fallen apart. Hainaut returned to neutrality. Brabant was angry at having lost the English wool trade route to the benefit of Flanders, which, despite regaining this advantage, was still waiting for the gold promised by the English. The Holy Roman Emperor, Louis of Bavaria, also distanced himself from England, unwilling to involve himself further in a conflict while already overwhelmed by problems in Germany. Edward III had thought the Kingdom of France would welcome him with open arms and crown him their new king. Instead, he was sorely disappointed. Though he had added fleur-de-lis to his coat of arms, he remained sovereign only in Flanders. The crown of St. Louis had never seemed further away for the Plantagenet. With neither side able to gain the upper hand, a truce was signed at Esplechin on September 25, 1340. Fighting was to cease in Flanders, Artois, Scotland, Aquitaine, and at sea. Each party retained the territories it had conquered. There was no winner, only 2 losers. Each side returned home in defeat, fully aware that the truce was nothing more than a chance for both adversaries to rebuild their strength before the next confrontation. As you can imagine, this truce would only be temporary. It was just one of many pauses that would punctuate the 100 Years' War. Thank you for watching. If you liked my content, make sure to like, share and comment the videos. Until then, see you soon for the next episode.